Good everyone and welcome to today's video, and today we have another episode in the recommended lineups for daily tests, and today we have the British Rank 2. Now before I begin, I'm just going to briefly, as I always do, explain the series, because obviously not everyone is going to be watching the series from the beginning. They might just be jumping ahead nations, which is fine. You may realise that some of the lineup vehicles are not the best for the consideration, but remember, this is meant to be a series dedicated towards new players. I will discuss vehicles that you can add into the lineups further down the line, and obviously with each vehicle where applicable. But obviously, if the vehicle does not need changing, that's where I'll obviously say this is the best vehicle for the job and is the most forgiving. So without further ado, we're going to get discussing the Cromwell V. This is a very good tank. It has very good characteristics. Its armor is a little bit weak, but that's kind of the point. It was a cruiser tank, not a infantry tank. So that is where it does fall a little bit short. However, its armor is not too bad. As long as you angle it, it can bounce some shots quite comfortably. The turret itself can also bounce a couple of shots. Its overall turret profile is also pretty good. The gun mantlet area is relatively trollish, but it can obviously be a bit of a weird one. The side armor, like the Crusaders, is double layered. It is actually 46mm of side armor, not 32, so you can actually angle this thing quite well, and it can bounce quite a few shots. But obviously don't rely on that, because remember the armor is as flat as a witch's tit, so just bear that in mind. But this is a tank where you have pretty much everything you'd need. You have a decent gun with good penetration, you have the high explosive, you have the M89 smoke, you have smoke grenades which come out the top of the vehicle, and you get 20 of them, and you don't exactly have a reverse gear in this poor thing, but it's still something to consider. Speaking of that, you'll notice on the inside it does actually have a little bit of composition. This is nothing to write home about, this is more meant for shrapnel, but it does actually help with its survivability a little bit. Doesn't make a huge difference, especially if someone hits the ammunition, but you get my point. This is just overall what is helping the vehicle, to be honest. And I'm sure, because my great-granddad served in one of these, I'm sure he appreciated that, especially given that there's big dangerous ammo behind him, but you get my point. My great-granddad served in Italy in one of these things, and yeah, he enjoyed it very much, but sadly he wanted to drive a Comet, but the Comet was too late by then, and plus he served in Italy, not the German front. So unfortunately he never got to drive a Comet, but well, I'm sure he's alright with that. Its overall gun though, it has a decent reload rate. The coaxial machine gun is also quite useful because it has API, so it can set fire to planes if a plane is unfortunate enough. Its overall turret traverse rate and its overall gun vertical guidance is pretty strong. And with it having a 600 horsepower engine and a 28-ton tank, this thing really does have it all. Except reverse gear, but, well, you can't have everything. In terms of vehicles to replace it with, there isn't a huge amount for a medium tank, but there are two candidates. If you want to go up slightly to 3.7 to increase the capabilities of the lineup, there is the Cromwell 1, which is just this with a 6-pounder, which has a bit more penetration but less shrapnel. Or you can upgrade to the Sherman 2, which was a British modification of the Sherman tank. Not a huge amount was really changed, but overall, it's a tank that we was desperate for in the war. And, well, we did a couple of changes of our own, and it made the tank very good. And in-game, it's still very good. You just lose that mobility that the Cromwell has. But overall, it's nothing too major. But overall, though, the Cromwell will do you fine for the most part. And like I said, if you want the extra penetration on this tank specifically, you just unlock the Cromwell 1 and you get the 6-pounder. Or if you want something with a stabilizer, you go with a Sherman. Moving on to the next vehicle, we have the SAR Mark 6-pounder. This is a really weird-looking armoured car, and this isn't actually British. This is a South African armoured car. And as you can tell, it's a bit of a creative one, to say the least. We call this the inbred Puma, for good reason, because this is an inbred Puma. 8 wheels, so it pretty much fits the Puma, and it looks weird, because it looks like it's got a Crusader turret stuck on it, although it's not an actual Crusader turret, but you get my point. So going over the vehicle, it's obviously not very good in terms of its armor. It's an armored car after all. It's not really meant to be taking hits on the front line. But where it makes up for it is its reverse rate of being 11.3 miles per hour, its forward speed, which is pretty dang good, but also its 6-pounder and the fact that it has a little 50 cal on the roof, which, when I say little, it's a big freaking gun. I mean, look at the size of it compared to the turret. This turret is small, and that 50 is almost as big as it, but you get my point. One thing to watch out with this vehicle, though, is the lower side armor, which is not too great, and obviously the wheels are very easily hit. But it looks like they've actually buffed the side armor. It used to be 8mm, now it's 16, which definitely helps it out a little bit. But obviously it is open top, so do bear that in mind when planes come knocking, and there's also a lot of ammunition stored around the vehicle, so do make sure to consider that. But the engines are not very strong. There's 2 engines back here, 190 horsepower. It is not the best in terms of it. Its overall power to weight ratio is a bit low, so whilst this thing will be slower in theory than the Cromwell, it does have a higher top speed. But where this thing makes up is the turret traverse and the gun. As I said, the 6-pounder is definitely one where you need to consider its firepower. And like I said, if you're upgrading to the Cromwell 1, you have this on a wheeled chassis, and it's really good. 122mm of pen at 10 meters, average penetration of about 100. This will be more than enough to deal with what you're dealing with. And like I said, you still get smoke, you still get the 50 cal, you get a 792 coax. This thing can do a lot, and it's very forgiving to new players. Unfortunately though, in terms of upgrades, there isn't really one, because this lineup doesn't have another light vehicle. And the only other one is a rank 3 vehicle, which we'll discuss soon anyway in the series, but once we get to Britain rank 3. But even then, this thing's more than enough and will definitely do the job you require. Next up, we have the Tank Destroyer, which, again, this is what happens when you give the British something that the Americans built, we just make it better. And this is the Achilles. Now, of course, we didn't make it better in terms of the turret traverse. That is its Achilles heel. See what I did there? That was your one pun. But this is a vehicle where you trade the post-pen APCBC of the M10, but you do gain quite a bit in terms of its overall capability. Its gun mantler is slightly redesigned. It has a few more funky angles, so you do have better turret survivability with this thing. But, of course, we do have thicker tracks in terms of its overall placement on the vehicle, so this does add a bit more protection once you unlock this this module. But as you can probably tell, that muzzle brake might look familiar to some people, and that's because that's the 17-pounder. Now, don't ask me how I managed to cram one of those in, but, well, the Israelis didn't like it, so they changed it as they do. But this is definitely something where you have to look at its overall, shall we say, its overall damage output, and this gun definitely has that. As you can see, with SAR Mark 8, it has 190mm of penetration at 10 meters. Average penetration on most maps will be between 172 and 155. You will be cutting through tanks like a hot knife through butter. And let's put it this way, there's very, very little that will be able to bounce around from this. And this gun is just that powerful. It comes with HE as well, so you really do have everything that you would need. It does have a 50 cal, so you can take out some planes and take out some light vehicles if you can't load a HE quick enough. It's definitely one to consider. Now, you can upgrade, per se, in terms of armor protection. I'm using air quotes in case anyone didn't figure that out. You can upgrade, in a way, to the 3-inch gun carrier, which I personally don't like this thing, but it's a bit better armored than the Achilles. Of course, its armor's flat, but you can angle this a lot easier. But you do lose the raw penetration. Its penetration is only about 110, so that's something to consider. And of course, with it being on a Churchill chassis, you're going to be a lot slower. But personally, I would not recommend a new player to do this. This is only if you want a bit better survivability with your tank destroyer. Just don't bother with this thing outside of that. The Achilles will look after you for the most part, and whilst it is open topped and very vulnerable to planes, this thing more than makes up for it with its capabilities. Next, we move on to your AA vehicle, which, again, this is one that Harry doesn't like, but for a different reason. We have the AEC AA armoured car. One of the most notorious armoured cars, and even these little bastards cause me trouble. This thing is very trollish with its survivability. Its overall armour is actually pretty good for an armoured car, with having a 50mm turret, a 20mm roof, and overall decent hull armour for an armoured car. This thing really does have great survivability for an armoured car. And even its lower, ow, just bit my tongue then, its lower armour is actually quite good. And its overall survivability is also quite solid because it has a 4-man crew. It's not bad at all. Its armour, well, its overall performance in terms of its off-road and overall drivability is not very good. But it is a vehicle where you can just pretty much shove it at anything and it'll do its job. Obviously, anti-tank duty is not this thing's strong suit, but, I mean, it's an armoured car with great survivability and a great turret to deal with enemy aircraft, let's put it that way. And trust me, if this thing needs to knock down a plane, it will. And you've got the turret traverse, you've got the armour to survive their hits. The only thing this thing won't survive well is bombs, which for obvious reasons, but near misses from rockets won't kill this thing. Near misses from small bombs won't kill this thing. They're going to need a big bomb to take this big boy down, and trust me, they're going to be very angry when this thing kills them before they get a chance to drop their bombs. Because trust me, this thing does that a lot. Now we move on to our fighter, and well, I don't need to explain the AEC because we don't really have an upgrade for it unless you go to rank 3, so it's the same as the SAR. But now we have the fighter. I've chosen the Typhoon Mark 1A. It doesn't have the best ground attack potential, but it's its overall performance and handling which is why I picked it. This has access to two 250-pounders or two 500-pounders, which don't really hamper the thing's performance too much. Its overall performance is quite high, having a Napier Sabre with nearly 2,000 horsepower. Its low altitude speed, where you're going to be spending a lot of your time in Tank RB, is extremely good. You can outrun pretty much anything that you're going to come across, and you can even outturn a lot of the planes that you'll come across that aren't Japanese or, in some cases, captured British planes. This thing is really good. And having 12 7.62s spread across the wings with 5,000 rounds, yeah, I think it's safe to say you're going to be slaughtering any poor sod on the receiving end of this. Obviously, you do lose your firepower towards the end because obviously some of the guns will run out before the others. But yeah, trust me, this thing is great. The bombs aren't, but that's the price you pay, unfortunately. In terms of aircraft to really replace this thing, there really isn't any candidates. I mean, if you're going to make a 3-7 lineup in the future, you can go for things like the Firebrand, but the problem is Britain's 3-7 lineup really doesn't exist. And as you can see, the only tanks that they have are the Sherman 2 and the Cromwell 1. So if you are upgrading to the Sherman 2 for the Cromwell, you can bring along the Firebrand, which is a perfectly solid one. It's one that I personally like. It's not a very good fighter, but it does have the 4 Hispano Mark 5s, good bomb loads and everything. And if you really want to meme around, you can bring the Tempest Vickers P. But obviously this is a strike aircraft classed as, but it's also pseudo-fighter sort of thing. But in terms of a proper fighter, this is really the best you can get, and that's really what the Typhoon is good for. It's just something you can unlock straight away, get the bombs unlocked, and that's all you really need to do. And finally, we come to the strike aircraft, which, again, I'm going to discuss the Firebrand again in a moment, but this is something where you have to kind of consider other options as well. The Bowfighter Mark 6 is definitely one where you can just take the overall firepower that you get, which is 4 20mm Hispanos, and of course a couple of bombs. This is something where you can upgrade it. The 420s are very good for ground attack, and of course the two 500-pound bombs are very nice as well. These are the post-war 500-pounders, so these are, well, the later war 500-pounders, I should say. So they do have a bit more punch than your typical, well, the ones on the Typhoon, let's put it that way. But in terms of its overall replacement, as I said earlier about the Tiffy, you do have the Firebrand, which I personally like this thing quite a bit. You do have custom loadouts on it, so you can have a little bit of a fiddle with it. It is a nice plane. I personally very much enjoy the Firebrand, but that's me personally. In terms of keeping it safe of a newer player perspective, the best you could probably upgrade to if you want to stay at 3.3 is the Mark 10. If you're going up to 3.7, you have the Mark 21, which is just a massive improvement. I'll quickly put it in this crew so I can demonstrate. But as you can see, it's got custom loadouts. You have access to 1,000-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs, and its overall capabilities is very good. It even comes with a torpedo for naval, so if you are a closet naval player, you can enjoy this. And it's also got the most heavy firepower out of all the bow fighters, with it having the 420s, but these are Mark 2s, so they have a bit better fire rate, but also 450 cals in the wings. And of course, you still keep the rear gunner, which is a positive, I suppose. But yeah, that's personally what I would recommend if you're going to go up to 3.7. Otherwise, the Mark 10 pretty much does this thing, but a little bit worse. That's really to consider. But anyway, I'm going to leave it all to it for today. I really hope you enjoyed seeing the Britain 3.3 lineup covered as part of the recommended lineups for daily tests. And next up will be Japan at rank 2. Then obviously we'll move on to China, Italy, France, Sweden. And then we'll move on to rank 3s. Anyway, I'm going to leave you all to it for today. I hope you enjoyed seeing this lineup overall talked about. And I'll see you all on the next one.